Hello. Sorry for being unconventional with the presentation. The classroom I normally use is having tech issues, and the backup classroom I normally use is having tech issues, so we're on a bit of a third string here. I will be presenting for a class that is called Gender and Power in Medieval Europe, and I will be presenting on a woman named Hadewijch. So first off, we don't know much about Hadewijch as a person. We can glean a lot from her writings and from the writings of her contemporaries, but as to the actual person and the time before her kind of literary stint, we really don't know much. She's called Hadewijch of Antwerp or of Brabant, so we know that she's kind of from this general region, but we don't have anything more specific than that. The other kind of issue we have is that this is before the Belgian Renaissance, so we don't have a lot of artwork of the time period. Nothing contemporary, nothing really solid to know any kind of things about the area. But what we do have is quite a bit of artwork post-Renaissance. Things that are kind of looking back, trying to depict what they look like. And so we can kind of get a closer idea, but nothing really exact. To kind of put in other context of the time period we're talking about, Hadewijch lived during the 13th century. This is a time when, following the 1214 King Philip II of France's defeat of the Council of Flanders, means that large portions of Belgium were actually under French control. Now, we don't necessarily think that the area that Hadewijch was living in was under direct French control, but it was under soft French control. There was a lot of French influences and a lot of cultures and that sort of thing. So we can think about that kind of also influencing the time that Hadewijch lived. The other and the most notable thing about Hadewijch, and the thing that she is most famous for, is her position of a Beguine. Beguines are an extremely odd group by today's standards, and especially looking at them. They are a group of people that have essentially secluded themselves and isolated themselves away from the general populations to live a kind of nun-like life. Now, we have Beguines and Begards. Beguines are the fully female group, and Begards are the fully male group. A group of Beguines is known as Beguinages, which is basically a group of Beguines getting together and creating their own little kind of cloistered-like groupings. Now, these groupings usually were self-led, either by collective vote, or they had one individual that was known as kind of a teacher figure. This would have been the most educated Beguine, and kind of like acting as both mother figure and kind of a teacher to help the other Beguines in both spiritual and educational lessons. The other thing that's important to know about Beguines is that they were not sanctioned by the church. So a lot of their kind of ideas and theological kind of dealings and outlooks on life were almost bordering on heterodoxical. They were very controversial to especially the church at the time that wanted a lot more kind of like centralized control over the churches and what was being talked about to the laymen. And it's also separate from the church in terms of their seclusion, because they were these kind of like cloistered groups separate from what the normal nunneries we would see that would have an abbot or abbess kind of overseeing them. So these kinds of separations from the church led to, as I said before, some heterodoxical beliefs, which is the second hat that Hadewijch typically wore and became known for. That was that of a mystic. Now, Hadewijch began seeing her visions in late teenage years. Visions were controversial in the church because there was very impossible to prove the validity of the kinds of visions. It's also hard to get an idea of kind of the specifics of the visions and how they worked depending on the person and their kind of like level of detail. One good thing about Hadewijch for us as historians is that she was extremely specific with what she wrote about. And she was extremely vivid with her descriptions of these visions. So one kind of idea that she had played a lot into her visions, and specifically her theological teaching, was the interplay between the body and the soul, and how theologically those were separated or interplayed depending. And the things that were affecting the body can affect the soul both in life and in afterlife. Now, this may not seem very, very out there yet, but we also need to look at kind of the culture surrounding the ideas about body and soul during Hadewijch's time. So Mary Suderman talks about how medieval women tended to have more an idea of bodily and a more kind of a presentation of body rather than men being more presentation of soul. There's the idea of women being more of body than of soul, and men being more of soul than body. This is also backed up by the theory of humors that placed women as being more earthly, as opposed to the men being more ethereal in their kinds of makeup and compositions. So where this also comes into play is Hadewijch had a very distinct idea of what was good for the body and what was good for the soul, and very different from the church. Some of her visions definitely included these kinds of distinctions and the ideas of outer body versus inner body experiences. One thing that was a definitive kind of point of Hadewijch's visions is that Hadewijch seemed very obsessed with the idea of God's body and wanting to get to know God's body in a physical form. This is very different and heterodoxical to what the Christians of the time believed with the body of Christ post-death or before resurrection. Hadewijch saw God's body as being something that was physically corporeal that she could interact with in a physical form at the current time. And this desire to know this physical form in intimate ways. Wanting to get to know God both in body and in divinity. And to conjoin in a sort of mystical and sensual sense to become one without difference. The other thing about Hadewijch is that she's very descriptive about her visions, and almost to the point of vulgarity, where it is very descriptive about the kinds of ways in which both the divine and human body of God would enter her and as a person and as a soul. Which kind of also plays into the third hat that she wears, that of a very adept writer. So here on the left we have an example of one of the manuscripts that has been reprinted of Hadewijch's, and on the right we actually have one of her letters that has been transcribed here. Hadewijch was known especially well for being extremely well educated, even beyond what would have been normal for a beguine. She was extremely versed in French, Latin, and the vernacular Dutch at the time, and was able to write in all three of those languages. Excuse me. Now this is a huge big deal because it means she was also one of the people pioneering for a lot of kind of religious texts in the vernacular language at this time. She was also extremely well versed in her poetry and in her letters. Her letter here, for example, is almost reading more like a poem rather than an actual letter. In that well-versedness and the records of her writing, we also come across another bit of an oddity with Hadewijch that we don't see in other beguines or very much in other ecclesiastical figures, and that is the idea of same-sex attraction. Here in this letter, she even specifically talks about her yearning for another fellow beguine, one of Sarah, who, as the letter says, was not reciprocated. Hadewijch is very open in her writings about her both desire and experience with other women and other beguines in ways that we don't often see being openly exposed from a lot of medieval kind of writings. It's something that's very unique to Hadewijch and has been very pondering to a lot of historians. Some historians have claimed that Hadewijch is a character that is being portrayed and not an actual person. Other historians are saying that Hadewijch is using their writings as a way of exploring things that they can't outside of those writings and in their normal everyday life, in her normal everyday lives. It's more of a kind of outlet for these kinds of same-sexual feelings rather than being representative of what she is actually doing. And of course, there's historians in the middle that are like, well, you can't get much more obvious than this. They're not roommates. So it's kind of a ongoing debate that's still being talked about even today. And we don't have much else to go on other than Hadewijch's poetry and letters that we have accumulated over the time. There's also been, unfortunately, a lot of debate as to the authenticity of the letters and the poetry. Some have been attributing them to different styles and attributing different styles to being different authors, while others have said that it's been different points throughout her life and her developing style as an author. Overall, we don't really know much about Hadewijch, but she's a very interesting character, and she's an interesting character because of all the different roles she plays throughout her life. We have these three different kind of ideas about the person that she was, that of a beguine, that of a mystic, and that of a writer, and the interplay between those three different lives. We can see the ways in which she influenced both her gender and her power at the time in order to carve out a place for her in societies that normally she wouldn't. As a beguine, she was able to be literary, but her literary was able to give her a voice for her theological ideas and those of a mystic, which she wouldn't otherwise. This idea of her being a literary and a beguine and a mystic was able to give her a voice even outside of her time today as we study her as historians.